Lyra didn't know that the man walking down the prison corridor was the most powerful alpha in the Seven Kingdoms. She didn't know that he had personally reviewed every case file in preparation for the Great Amnesty, and she certainly didn't know that he had already decided her fate before he ever set foot in the dungeon that would change both their lives forever. She only knew that the cells were emptying one after another, and hers wasn't. The sound of metal grinding against stone echoed through the underground chambers as guard after guard unlocked door after door. Prisoners stumbled out into the torchlit corridor, blinking like moles in sudden sunlight, clutching pardons stamped with the royal seal. Some wept, others laughed. A few fell to their knees in gratitude to whatever gods had blessed them with freedom on this most unexpected of days. Lyra pressed herself against the cold stone wall of her cell and watched it all through the narrow gap between the iron bars. 3 months she had been here. 3 months since her stepmother's poisonous lies had landed her in chains, accused of treason she could never have imagined, much less committed. 3 months of stale bread and stagnant water, and the growing certainty that she would die in this place, forgotten and alone. Hope was a dangerous thing in a dungeon. She had learned that lesson well. But as cell after cell opened and prisoner after prisoner walked free, something treacherous unfurled in her chest despite every wall she had built around her heart. The footsteps grew closer. "Marcus Webb!" A guard's voice rang out, sharp and official. The man 3 cells down from her sobbed as his door swung wide. "By order of His Majesty, you are hereby pardoned and released." 2 cells down, then 1. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bars, pressing her face between them to see down the corridor. A cluster of guards moved with military precision, flanked by men in fine clothes who read from scrolls and checked names against lists. At the centre of the group walked a figure she couldn't quite make out in the dancing torchlight. Elena Marsh. The woman in the cell next to hers let out a broken cry of relief as her door opened. Pardoned and released. Silence fell over the corridor like a held breath. Lyra's cell was the last one, the very end of the row, the place where they put the ones they wanted to forget about entirely. She sank back against the wall, that treacherous hope crumbling to ash in her mouth. Of course she would be the only one left behind, the only one deemed unworthy of the king's mercy, the only one whose name wasn't on any list because no one alive cared enough to speak for her. The footsteps stopped directly outside her cell. "Your Majesty," she heard one of the guards say, his voice tight with nervousness. "This is the last one, Lyra Ashford, charged with treason against the crown. The evidence against her was substantial." Lyra closed her eyes, waiting for them to move on, waiting for the footsteps to retreat and leave her to whatever fate awaited traitors who weren't worth a king's pardon. She had survived this long on scraps and stubbornness. She could survive a little longer. "Open it." The voice that spoke those 2 words was nothing like she expected, deep and rough and edged with something she couldn't name. Not the cold authority of a judge pronouncing sentence, something else entirely, something that made her breath catch and her heart forget how to beat properly. "Sire?" The guard sounded confused. "But the evidence—" "I said open it." There was no mistaking the command in those words, no room for argument or hesitation. The guard fumbled with his keys, metal jangling against metal as he found the right one. The lock turned with a grinding protest, and then her cell door swung open for the first time in 3 months. Lyra opened her eyes. The man standing in her doorway was tall enough to fill the entire frame. Broad shoulders strained against a dark coat that probably cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. His hair was black as midnight and longer than fashion dictated, as if he cared nothing for court propriety. But it was his eyes that made her forget how to breathe. Gold, pure molten gold, like sunlight trapped in amber, and they were focused on her with an intensity that made her feel pinned like a butterfly to velvet. Something impossible happened the moment their gazes met. Heat bloomed in her chest, spreading outward like spilled wine through silk. A golden thread seemed to stretch between them, thrumming with recognition and rightness and a dozen other things she had no names for. The very air in the cell changed, became charged and electric and alive. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated, in the sharp intake of breath that made his chest rise, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as if he were fighting not to reach for something. "You!" The word fell from his lips like a prayer, like a curse, like the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. Lyra scrambled to her feet, pressing herself back against the wall. Her prison dress hung loose on her too thin frame, patched and stained, and evidence of everything she had endured in this place. She was nobody, nothing, a servant girl who had been convenient to blame when her step-family needed a scapegoat. What could a king possibly want with her? "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He stepped into the cell. The space that had felt cramped and suffocating, with just her in it, suddenly felt impossibly small, with him inside it too. He was larger than life, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with the crown she couldn't see, and everything to do with the raw authority that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "You're coming with me," he said, and there was something final in those words, something that brooked no argument and promised no explanation. The guards behind him shifted nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should—" "Dismissed!" He didn't take his eyes off her as he spoke. "All of you, now." The sound of boots on stone faded as the guards retreated, leaving them alone in a dungeon cell with nothing but torchlight and the impossible golden thread that seemed to bind them together. "I don't understand," Lyra said again, because it was the only truth she had left. "Why me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing." Something dangerous flashed in those golden eyes. "Don't." The single word was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute command. "Don't ever say that again." He reached toward her, slowly, as if she were a wild thing that might bolt. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she gasped at the shock of contact. Warmth raced down her spine and pooled in her belly, and that golden thread between them pulled taut with recognition. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like wonder. "I've been looking for you my whole life." And despite every reason she had to run, despite every lesson she had learned about trust and betrayal and the cruelty of hope, Lyra found herself leaning into his touch, found herself believing, for one impossible moment, that maybe she wasn't nobody after all. Maybe she was exactly who he had been looking for. The carriage that awaited them outside the prison was nothing like the rough transport wagons Lyra had expected. Gleaming black lacquer caught the afternoon sunlight, and the horses that pulled it were magnificent beasts with coats like polished obsidian. Everything about it screamed wealth and power, and a world so far removed from her own that she might as well have been looking at something from a fairy tale. "Your Majesty," she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Kieran," he said simply. "My name is Kieran." She stared at him. Kings didn't give their names to prisoners. Kings didn't personally escort anyone anywhere, much less someone accused of treason. Kings certainly didn't look at servant girls like they were precious things worth protecting. Yet here he was, doing all of those impossible things. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered. Something softened in those golden eyes. "I know, and I'll explain everything once we're somewhere safe, but right now I need you to trust me." Trust. The word hit her like a physical blow. She had trusted once, completely and without reservation. She had trusted her stepmother's smiles and her stepsister's promises and their assurances that they loved her like family. That trust had landed her in a dungeon cell, forgotten and left to rot. But when Kieran extended his hand to help her into the carriage, something in her chest pulled tight. That golden thread again, humming with warmth and recognition. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she placed her palm in his. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm. His fingers were warm and strong and calloused in a way that spoke of sword work rather than soft court living. When he helped her into the carriage, his touch was gentle, reverent almost, as if she were something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. The interior of the carriage was even more luxurious than the outside. Soft velvet cushions in deep burgundy, small windows with actual glass, and space enough for 6 people to sit comfortably. Lyra had never been inside anything so fine. She perched on the edge of one seat, afraid to lean back and soil the pristine fabric with her prison dress. Kieran settled across from her, but even with the generous space between them, she was acutely aware of his presence. He seemed to fill the entire carriage with his quiet intensity, and every time the wheels hit a bump in the road, that golden thread between them seemed to pull a little tighter. "Where are we going?" she asked, because the silence was becoming unbearable. "My home," he said simply, "the palace." It wasn't a question. Of course he would take her to the palace, where she would be even more out of place than she was now, if such a thing were possible. Yes. He studied her face with those unsettling golden eyes. "You're afraid." "I'm terrified," she admitted, because lying seemed pointless when he could apparently read her like an open book. "I don't know why you helped me. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know anything except that 3 hours ago I thought I was going to die in that cell, and now I'm sitting in a royal carriage wearing rags and trying not to panic." "I want nothing from you that you're not willing to give," he said quietly. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they made that heat in her chest flare brighter, made her think about all the things she might be willing to give if he asked. The thought terrified her almost as much as everything else. "Tell me about yourself," he said, and there was something careful in his voice, as if he were trying very hard not to spook her. "There's nothing to tell. I was a servant in Lord Ashford's household until—" She swallowed hard. "Until they decided I was more useful as a scapegoat than a kitchen maid." "What did they accuse you of?" "Stealing correspondence meant for the crown, passing secrets to enemies of the realm." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. It was a lie, all of it. But who would believe the word of a bastard servant girl against a noble family? Something dangerous flickered across Kieran's features. "Tell me their names." The quiet fury in his voice made her shiver. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me." The intensity in his golden gaze was almost too much to bear. She looked out the window instead, watching the countryside roll past. They had left the city behind, and now they travelled through rolling hills dotted with farms and forests. It was beautiful in a way she had almost forgotten existed. In prison, it was easy to believe that the whole world was made of stone and shadow. "You didn't answer my question," Kieran said softly. "Lady Catherine Ashford," she said finally, "my stepmother, and her daughters, Helena and Margot." Speaking their names aloud felt like poison on her tongue. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why did they choose you?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, watching a flock of birds wheel across the sky. "Because I was convenient," she said at last. "Because when the king's investigators came looking for the real traitor, they needed someone to blame, someone no one would miss. They were wrong." The words were quiet, but absolutely certain. "Someone would have missed you." She looked at him then, startled by the conviction in his voice. "Who?" "Me." He leaned forward slightly, and that golden thread between them hummed with warmth. "I would have missed you. I would have torn the kingdom apart looking for you." The words should have been impossible, ridiculous. They had known each other for less than a day. But something in his voice, something in the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world, made her believe him despite all reason. "I still don't understand," she whispered. "I know." His smile was soft, almost sad. "But you will, when you're ready." The carriage began to slow, and Lyra looked out the window to see massive gates approaching. Beyond them rose a palace that took her breath away. Towers stretched toward the sky like fingers reaching for the gods, and every window caught the late afternoon sun like captured starlight. It was beautiful and imposing, and utterly alien to someone who had spent her life sleeping in servants' quarters and kitchen corners. "I can't," she said suddenly, panic rising in her throat. "I can't go in there. I don't belong in a place like that." "Hey!" Kieran's voice was gentle, but when she looked at him, his gaze was fierce. "You belong wherever I say you belong, and I say you belong with me." The carriage rolled to a stop. Through the windows she could see servants in fine livery waiting to attend them. In moments those doors would open, and she would have to step out into a world where she had no place and no protection except the inexplicable kindness of a king she didn't understand. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Kieran said, reaching for the door handle. "You let me take care of you, the way I should have been doing all along." And despite every reason she had to be afraid, despite every lesson she had learned about trusting people with power over her, Lyra found herself nodding, found herself ready to follow him into his impossible world, held together by nothing more than a golden thread and the promise in his eyes that she would never be alone again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion and wonder that left Lyra feeling like she was living someone else's life. The rooms Kieran had given her were larger than the entire servants' quarters she had once called home. Silk hangings in shades of cream and gold adorned the walls, and the bed was so soft she had spent the first 3 nights sleeping on the floor beside it, unable to trust such luxury. But it was the clothes that made her feel like the greatest impostor of all. Gowns of midnight blue and forest green, with skirts that rustled like whispered secrets and bodices that fit her as if they had been made specifically for her body. Which she was beginning to suspect they had been. "How did you know?" she asked Kieran on the morning of her 4th day, fingering the delicate embroidery on her sleeve as they walked through his private gardens. "My size, I mean. These dresses, they fit perfectly." He was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as they strolled between rows of roses that perfumed the air with their sweetness. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I've been having your clothes made for 2 years." Lyra stopped walking. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "What?" "I knew about your case long before yesterday," he said, turning to face her. Those golden eyes were steady, unflinching, but she could see something vulnerable lurking in their depths. "I've been investigating the charges against you since the day you were arrested." "You've known I was innocent this whole time?" Her voice rose with each word, anger and betrayal warring in her chest. "I spent 3 months in that hell, and you knew?" "Building a case takes time," he said quietly. "I had to be thorough. I had to have evidence that would stand against the word of a noble family. If I had moved too quickly—" "I could have died in there!" The words tore from her throat, raw and furious. "I could have rotted away to nothing, and you were what? Taking measurements for ball gowns?" "Do you think it was easy for me?" The careful control in his voice cracked, revealing the pain underneath. "Do you think I didn't want to tear those prison walls down with my bare hands every night? Do you think I slept well, knowing you were suffering while I played politics with lawyers and judges?" The raw anguish in his voice stopped her anger cold. She stared at him, seeing for the first time the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Then why didn't you?" she whispered. "Because I'm not just a man who wanted to save you," he said, his voice rough with honesty. "I'm a king, and kings can't act on impulse, no matter how much they want to. Kings have to think about precedent and law and the stability of the realm, even when it's killing them." Something in her chest cracked open at the pain in his voice. She took a step closer, drawn by that golden thread that never seemed to stop pulling her toward him. "Tell me about the real traitor," she said softly. "Your stepmother's youngest daughter, Margot. She was passing information to Lord Blackwood's faction in exchange for a promise of marriage to his eldest son." His jaw tightened. "When my investigators got close to the truth, they panicked, needed a scapegoat. You were convenient. And now?" "Now Margot is in the same cell you occupied," he said with grim satisfaction, "and her mother and sister are facing charges of their own." The words should have filled her with vindication, with triumph. Instead, all she felt was a bone-deep weariness. "It doesn't change anything. It doesn't give me back those 3 months. It doesn't undo what they did to me." "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you sooner. I'm sorry you had to suffer while I built my careful case. I'm sorry you have every reason not to trust me." The apology hung between them in the morning air, sincere and devastating. Lyra looked at him, really looked, and saw not the powerful king who could command armies with a word, but a man who carried the weight of difficult choices and the burden of protecting people who would never know his name. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her chest for days finally finding voice. "Out of all the wrongly convicted prisoners in your kingdom, why did you personally investigate my case? Why do you care what happens to one servant girl?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the roses blooming around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because the moment I saw your name in that report, something in my chest caught fire. Because I couldn't sleep until I saw your face. Because every instinct I possessed screamed that you were important in ways I couldn't understand." He looked at her then, and the vulnerability in his golden eyes took her breath away. "Because you're my mate, Lyra, my other half, the person my soul has been searching for my entire life." The words hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Mate. She had heard the term whispered about in servant gossip, spoken of in hushed tones like something from fairy tales. The supernatural bond that tied shifters to their perfect match. The connection that transcended logic and reason and social standing. "That's not possible," she whispered, even as that golden thread in her chest blazed with recognition. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing special." "Stop!" The command in his voice made her breath catch. "Stop saying that. You are everything, Lyra. You are the missing piece of my soul, the answer to every prayer I never knew how to pray. You are the reason I wake up in the morning and the last thing I think about before I sleep." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a warm embrace. "You feel it too. I know you do. That pull between us, that sense of rightness when we're together." She did feel it, had been feeling it since the moment their eyes met in that dungeon cell. The golden thread that seemed to bind them together, the way her body relaxed in his presence, despite every reason to be afraid. The sense that she had been searching for something her whole life without knowing what it was. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible. "Of me?" "Of this, of trusting someone again, of believing that maybe I matter to someone." Her voice broke on the last words. "What if you change your mind? What if you realise I'm not worth all this trouble?" "Impossible." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unshakable. "Lyra, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and the intensity of his gaze stole what little breath she had left. "I have spent 32 years on this earth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. 32 years believing I would rule alone, that the gods had not seen fit to bless me with a mate. I had accepted that I would live and die without ever knowing what it felt like to be complete. And then I saw your name on that report, and everything changed, everything." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm against her skin, calloused and gentle and absolutely certain. "You are not nothing," he said fiercely. "You are everything I never knew I needed. You are home and hope and healing all wrapped into one impossible gift. And I will spend every day for the rest of our lives proving that to you, if you'll let me." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable, soft and careful and reverent, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he held her too tightly. But when she melted into his touch, when her hands fisted in the front of his shirt to pull him closer, the kiss deepened into something desperate and necessary and right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, that golden thread between them hummed with contentment. For the first time since her arrest, Lyra felt something that might have been peace. "Stay with me," Kieran whispered against her forehead, his arms tight around her. "Whatever comes next, whatever obstacles we face, stay with me." And despite every reason she had to run, despite every lesson she had learned about the danger of trusting powerful men, Lyra found herself nodding, found herself choosing to believe in the impossible bond that tied them together. "I'll stay," she whispered back, and felt something broken inside her chest begin to heal. 3 weeks into her new life, Lyra was beginning to believe that maybe fairy tales could come true after all. The nightmares had started to fade, replaced by mornings spent walking in Kieran's gardens and evenings curled beside him in the library, reading while he worked on matters of state. The golden thread between them had grown stronger, more certain, until she could feel his presence, even when they were in different wings of the palace. She should have known it was too good to last. "Your Majesty," Sir Marcus announced from the doorway of the breakfast room, his face grim with the kind of news that shattered peaceful mornings. "Lady Catherine Ashford has arrived at court. She's requesting an immediate audience." The cup of tea in Lyra's hands began to rattle against the saucer. Kieran's gaze snapped to her immediately, those golden eyes blazing with protective fury the moment he saw her pale face. "Tell her she can wait," he said coldly, not taking his eyes off Lyra, "indefinitely. Sire, she's not alone. She's brought Lord Blackwood and several members of the High Council with her. They're invoking their right to petition the Crown directly." Sir Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable. "They're claiming irregularities in the case against Lady Margot. They want to discuss the King's personal involvement in the investigation." Something cold settled in Lyra's stomach. She set down her teacup before she could drop it, her hands shaking too hard to hold anything steady. "They know about us." "They suspect," Kieran corrected, but his jaw was tight with barely controlled anger. "They're fishing for leverage." "And they'll find it." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I should go. I should pack my things and leave before this gets worse for you." "Sit down." The command in his voice was absolute, unmistakable. When she hesitated, he gentled his tone, but not his resolve. "Sit down, Lyra. You're not going anywhere." "You don't understand," she said, but she sank back into her chair despite herself. "My stepmother doesn't do anything without a plan. If she's here, if she brought Lord Blackwood, she has something. Some way to hurt you through me. Then we'll face it together." "No." The word tore from her throat, desperate and fierce. "I won't be the weapon they use against you. I won't be the reason your enemies gain power. I won't—" "Breathe." He was out of his chair and kneeling beside her before she could finish the sentence, his hands gentle on her face. "Look at me. Breathe." She tried to focus on his golden eyes, on the warmth of his touch, on the steady certainty in his voice, but panic clawed at her chest, making it hard to think past the terrible certainty that this was how it would all end, that her stepmother would find a way to destroy the one good thing that had ever happened to her. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "You won't." His voice was steel wrapped in velvet, unshakable and sure. "I promise you, whatever they're planning, whatever they think they know, you won't lose me." Sir Marcus cleared his throat delicately. "Your Majesty, they're waiting in the throne room. The longer you delay, the more it appears you have something to hide." Kieran's eyes never left Lyra's face. "What do you need from me?" The question caught her off guard. Not what she should do, not what would be best for the kingdom. What she needed. As if her feelings, her fears, her comfort mattered more than politics and protocol. "I need to face them," she said quietly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. I need to stop running from these people. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Something fierce and determined sparked to life in her chest. I've spent my whole life letting them make me feel small and worthless and afraid. I won't do it any more, not when I finally know who I really am. Pride blazed in Kieran's eyes. Then we go together, as equals. The throne room was exactly as intimidating as Lyra had imagined it would be. Soaring ceilings painted with scenes of ancient kings and queens, massive windows that cast rainbow light through stained glass, and at the centre of it all, the golden throne where Kieran held court. But it was the small cluster of people standing before the throne that made her blood run cold. Lady Catherine looked exactly as she always had, beautiful in a sharp, calculating way, with steel grey hair pinned in an elaborate style and a dress that probably cost more than most people's yearly wages. Beside her stood Lord Blackwood, a thin man with cruel eyes and a smile that never reached past his lips. 3 other lords flanked them, men Lyra didn't recognise, but who radiated the same predatory energy as carrion birds circling wounded prey. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine said, sinking into a curtsy that managed to be respectful and mocking at the same time. "How kind of you to finally see us, though I confess I'm surprised to see you've brought company." Her gaze fixed on Lyra with the kind of loathing usually reserved for things found on the bottom of shoes. In her borrowed finery, with her hair carefully arranged and her chin held high, Lyra knew she looked nothing like the terrified servant girl they had sent to prison. But the hatred in her stepmother's eyes was exactly the same. "Lady Lyra is here at my invitation," Kieran said smoothly, taking his place on the throne with the kind of casual authority that made it clear he belonged there, as she has every right to be. "Lady Lyra?" Lord Blackwood's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Surely your Majesty jests. This creature is a bastard servant, nothing more, the daughter of a kitchen maid and whatever man happened to catch her fancy." "You will watch your tongue when speaking of my mate," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that made the temperature in the room seem to plummet. "Or I will have it removed." The words hit the assembled nobles like a physical blow. Several gasps echoed through the chamber, and Lady Catherine went white as parchment before a flush of rage mottled her cheeks. "Your mate?" she sputtered. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This nothing has clearly used some kind of witchcraft to ensnare you. She's not fit to clean your boots, let alone—" "Careful." The single word from Kieran carried the weight of absolute threat. "You are speaking of the future queen of this realm. Choose your next words very carefully." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face. Future queen. The words echoed in her head like thunder, too enormous to fully comprehend. Beside her, she could feel Kieran's steady presence, his unwavering certainty in the face of their shock and outrage. "This is madness," Lord Blackwood declared. "The kingdom will never accept a bastard servant as their queen. The noble houses will revolt before they bow to such what?" Kieran's voice was deadly soft. "Say it. Tell me exactly what you think of my mate." "She's nothing," Lady Catherine exploded, her careful facade finally cracking. "She's worthless trash that should have stayed in the gutter where she belongs. I don't care what lies she's told you, what spells she's cast, she will never be anything more than a bastard nobody." The words hung in the air like poisonous smoke. For a moment Lyra felt the old shame, the old certainty that maybe they were right. Maybe she was nothing. Maybe she didn't deserve the love of a king. Then she looked at Kieran's face. Fury blazed in those golden eyes like the heart of a star. When he spoke, his voice carried the power of an alpha's command, rolling through the throne room with supernatural force that made every person present feel the weight of his displeasure. "You forget yourself," he said, rising from his throne with predatory grace. "You forget who you are speaking to, and more importantly, who you are speaking about." He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing like a death knell. When he reached Lyra's side, He took her hand in his fingers warm and strong and absolutely certain. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room, "is worth more than all of you combined. She is brave and kind and honest in ways that none of you could comprehend. She has survived betrayal and imprisonment and cruelty that would have broken lesser souls. And she stands here now with her head held high because she knows her own worth." He lifted their joined hands, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. "She is my mate, my equal, my queen, and anyone who speaks against her speaks against me." "Your Majesty," Lord Blackwood tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Think of the kingdom. Think of the stability of the realm. A bastard queen will bring nothing but chaos." "The only chaos in this kingdom comes from people like you," Kieran cut him off. "People who think birth matters more than character. People who would rather tear down someone good than examine their own failures." He turned to face the assembled nobles fully, and something in his stance made it clear that the patient, diplomatic king was gone. In his place stood the alpha, the warrior, the protector who would burn the world to keep his mate safe. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of royal decree. "Lady Lyra Ashford will be my queen. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to find another kingdom to call home." The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Catherine opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air, while Lord Blackwood's face cycled through several interesting shades of purple. "This isn't over," Lady Catherine finally managed, her voice shaking with rage. "The noble houses will never accept this. You'll have civil war before you have that creature on the throne." "Then I'll fight a civil war," Kieran said simply, "and I'll win." He pulled Lyra closer, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "Because she is everything, and you are nothing, and deep down you know it. That's why you've spent so much time trying to convince her otherwise." Lady Catherine's face twisted with such hatred that for a moment she looked like something inhuman. But when she spoke again, her voice was deadly quiet. "You'll regret this, Your Majesty. Both of you." "Is that a threat?" Kieran asked mildly. "It's a promise." "Then you are no longer welcome in my court," he said, his tone conversational but his eyes blazing. "Guards, please escort Lady Catherine and her associates to the border. See that they understand they are not to return." As the guards moved to comply, Kieran turned back to Lyra. In his eyes she saw no regret, no second thoughts, no hint that he wished he had chosen differently. Only love, fierce and protective and absolutely certain. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his hand gentle on her cheek. Lyra looked at the man who had just declared war on half his kingdom for her sake, who had chosen her over politics and peace and the easy path, who had looked her enemies in the eye and called her everything while they called her nothing. "I love you," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like a prayer. His smile was radiant, transforming his face from forbidding to beautiful. "And I love you, forever and always, my queen." The kiss he gave her was soft and sweet and full of promise, and for the first time in her life, Lyra believed she truly deserved it. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of paradise that Lyra had never imagined possible. Word of the confrontation in the throne room had spread through the palace like wildfire, and while some nobles grumbled privately about the king's choice, none dared voice their objections openly, not after witnessing Kieran's fierce protection of his mate. "Good morning, your ladyship," said Elena, one of the younger maids, as she brought Lyra her morning tea. The title still made Lyra uncomfortable, but she was learning to accept it with grace rather than protest. Elena had been one of the first servants to embrace her new status, perhaps because she understood what it meant to serve rather than be served. "Good morning," Lyra replied warmly, accepting the delicate porcelain cup. "How is your mother's cough?" "Much better, my lady, thank you for asking. The medicine you suggested worked wonders." Elena beamed. She says you're an angel sent from the gods themselves." As Elena bustled around the room, straightening things that were already perfectly arranged, Lyra reflected on how much had changed. The servants who had once been wary of her now sought her out for advice on everything from family troubles to herb gardens. She had found her place in the palace not through royal decree, but through simple kindness and the recognition that she understood their world in ways the nobility never could. "His Majesty is waiting for you in the breakfast room," Elena added as she prepared to leave. "He seems particularly eager to see you this morning." Lyra's pulse quickened at the words. Even after all these weeks, the sight of Kieran still made her heart race. The golden thread between them had grown so strong that she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own, and this morning his anticipation was practically humming through their bond. She found him pacing beside the tall windows that overlooked the gardens, still dressed in the simple shirt and breeches he favoured for their private mornings together. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, the smile that lit his face was radiant. "There you are," he said, crossing to her in 3 quick strides. His hands found her waist, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted of morning and possibility. "I have something for you." "Another dress," she teased, "because I think I have more gowns now than I could wear in a lifetime." "Something better than a dress." His eyes sparkled with mischief and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "Close your eyes. Kieran, trust me." The simple words carried more weight than a royal command. She closed her eyes, feeling his hands leave her waist. There was a soft rustle of movement, the whisper of fabric, and then his voice, rougher now with emotion. "Open them." Lyra's eyes flew open, and her heart stopped beating entirely. Kieran knelt before her on one knee, a ring box open in his hands. The ring inside was unlike anything she had ever seen. A perfect sapphire the colour of midnight sky, surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light like captured stars. It was beautiful and elegant and utterly impossible. "Lyra," he said, his voice thick with love and certainty. "I know we're already bound by something deeper than any human ceremony could create. I know the mate bond makes you mine in ways that transcend law or custom. But I want more than that. I want to choose you, publicly and officially, in front of gods and witnesses. I want to marry you." Tears blurred her vision, making the ring shimmer like something from a dream. "Kieran, I want to wake up beside you for the rest of my life," he continued, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "I want to rule this kingdom with you at my side. I want to build something beautiful together, something that will last long after we're gone. I want to be your husband, not just your mate." "You don't have to," she started, but he shook his head. "I want to. Gods, Lyra, I want to more than I've ever wanted anything. You make me better. You make me whole. You make me remember that being king isn't just about power and duty. It's about protecting the people you love." His voice broke slightly. "Will you marry me?" The word that fell from her lips was breathless, joyous, certain. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, and then he was standing, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed through her tears. When he set her down, his kiss was desperate and grateful and full of promise. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good," he murmured back, "because I plan to spend the rest of our lives giving you reasons to love me more." The days that followed their engagement were a whirlwind of wedding preparations that left Lyra's head spinning. The ceremony would be held in 6 weeks, enough time to plan something worthy of a royal wedding, but not so long that anticipation became torture. Kieran had insisted on doing things properly, with all the pageantry and tradition that befitted the marriage of a king. "The dress arrived this morning," announced Madame Celeste, the royal seamstress, as she swept into Lyra's chambers with an army of assistants. "Would your ladyship like to see it?" Lyra nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. The wedding dress was everything she had never dared dream of. Ivory silk that seemed to glow with inner light, delicate lace that looked like captured snowflakes, and a train that would trail behind her like liquid starlight. It was fit for a queen, which she supposed was exactly what she was becoming. "It's perfect," she breathed, touching the fabric with reverent fingers. "His Majesty chose every detail personally," Madame Celeste said with a knowing smile. "He spent hours with my assistants, describing exactly what he wanted. He said it had to be worthy of the most beautiful woman in the 7 kingdoms. That evening, as they walked through the gardens that had become their sanctuary, Lyra told Kieran about the dress fitting. He listened with the kind of focused attention he gave to matters of state, as if her happiness was the most important thing in his kingdom. "Are you nervous?" he asked as they settled on their favourite bench beneath the rose arbour. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if I make a mistake during the ceremony? What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if the nobles decide they can't accept me after all? Hey," he turned to face her fully, his hands gentle on her face. "Look at me. The only thing that matters is you and me, and the promises we make to each other. Everything else is just pageantry." "Easy for you to say," she said with a shaky laugh. "You were born to this. I still feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life. You want to know a secret?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I feel like that too sometimes. Like I'm just a boy playing at being king, hoping no one notices that I don't know what I'm doing half the time." The admission surprised her. In all their time together, she had never seen him as anything but completely confident in his role. "But then I remember something my father told me before he died," Kieran continued. "He said that being king isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about caring enough to keep trying to find them. It's about protecting the people who depend on you, even when it costs you everything." "And you do," Lyra said softly. "Care, I mean, more than anyone I've ever known. Because of you." His thumb brushed across her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realised had fallen. "You showed me what it means to fight for something that matters. You taught me that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with swords, but with patience and kindness and the courage to keep believing in something good." 3 weeks before the wedding, Lyra made a discovery that changed everything. She had been feeling unwell for several days, tired in a way that sleep couldn't cure, sensitive to smells that had never bothered her before. When the palace healer confirmed her suspicions, Lyra sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process the impossible news. "Pregnant," she whispered to herself as she walked back to her chambers. "I'm pregnant." The thought filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. A baby, their baby, a tiny person who would carry both their bloodlines, royal and common, mixed together in a way that would have scandalised the nobility just months ago. She found Kieran in his study, bent over correspondence that would normally have his full attention. But the moment she entered the room, he looked up, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" He was around his desk and beside her in seconds, his hands gentle on her arms. "You look pale. Are you feeling ill again?" "Kieran," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." The worry in his eyes intensified. "What is it? Whatever it is, we'll face it together." "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge to an entirely new future. For a moment, Kieran's face went completely blank, as if he couldn't quite process what she had said. Then understanding dawned, and the expression that crossed his features was one of pure, devastating joy. "Pregnant," he repeated, his voice thick with wonder. "You're pregnant. We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know it's earlier than we planned, and with the wedding coming up—" "Happy?" He laughed, the sound rich and incredulous. "Lyra, I'm ecstatic. I'm over the moon. He cupped her face in his hands, his golden eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're carrying our child, our baby. How could I be anything but the happiest man alive? Even though people will count the months, even though they'll whisper that we couldn't wait for the wedding." "Let them whisper," he said fiercely. "Let them count on their fingers and make their assumptions. Our child was conceived in love, and that's all that matters." He dropped to his knees then, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice soft with wonder. "I'm your father, and I already love you more than you could possibly imagine." Lyra's hand covered his, their fingers interlacing over the place where their child grew. "I love you," she said, the words carrying more weight than any royal decree. "And I love you," he replied, rising to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke of forever. "Both of you, my family." As they held each other in the fading afternoon light, Lyra marvelled at the journey that had brought her here. From a dungeon cell to a king's arms, from believing she was nothing to knowing she was everything that mattered to the man she loved. It was impossible and improbable and absolutely perfect. In 3 weeks she would become his queen. In 7 months she would give birth to their child. And for all the years that followed, she would wake up each morning knowing that she was exactly where she belonged. Home, safe, loved beyond measure. Everything she had never known she deserved, and everything she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves had blessed the union with perfect weather. Lyra stood at the window of her chambers, watching the kingdom come alive below. Banners in royal blue and gold fluttered from every building, and the streets were packed with citizens who had come from far and wide to witness their king's marriage. "It's time, my lady," said Elena softly from behind her. The maid's eyes were bright with tears of joy as she helped Lyra into her wedding dress. The ivory silk seemed to glow in the morning light, and the sapphires sewn into the bodice caught the sunlight like captured stars. Lyra's hand drifted to her stomach, where the smallest swell had begun to show. In 5 months, she and Kieran would welcome their first child. The thought filled her with a happiness so complete it took her breath away. "You look like a queen," Elena whispered, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "I feel like one," Lyra replied, and realised with wonder that it was true. The scared servant girl, who had cowered in a prison cell 6 months ago, was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. The cathedral bells began to ring, their joyous peals echoing across the kingdom. It was time. The great cathedral was packed beyond capacity. Every noble house in the 7 kingdoms had sent representatives, and what couldn't fit inside spilled out into the streets where mirrors had been arranged so that all could witness the ceremony. Lyra walked down the aisle on the arm of Sir Marcus, who had volunteered to stand in place of the father she had never known. "He looks like he might collapse from happiness," Sir Marcus murmured as they approached the altar, and Lyra looked up to see Kieran waiting for her. He was magnificent in his ceremonial robes, the golden crown of his father's resting on his dark hair. But it was his face that took her breath away. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in all his kingdom, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real and walking toward him. When Sir Marcus placed her hand in Kieran's, the golden thread between them blazed with such intensity that Lyra was surprised the entire congregation couldn't see it. His fingers tightened around hers, steady and warm and absolutely certain. "Dearly beloved," the high priest began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast cathedral, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of King Kieran Alexander Thornfield and Lady Lyra Ashford in the sacred bonds of matrimony." The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and sacred promises. When it came time for their vows, Kieran turned to face her fully, his golden eyes bright with unshed tears. "Lyra," he said, his voice rough with emotion, 6 months ago, I thought I knew what love was. I thought I understood what it meant to be complete. But you showed me I was living only half a life. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. You make me a better king and a better man. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to build a kingdom worthy of you, a home where our children will know only love and acceptance. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of our lives." "Kieran," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, "you saved me from a dungeon, but more than that, you saved me from believing I was nothing. You showed me that love isn't something you earn, it's something you choose to give and receive. You are my anchor, my safe harbour, my home. I promise to love you with everything I am. I promise to stand beside you as we rule together, to be your partner in all things. I promise to choose you always and forever, no matter what challenges we face. By the power vested in me by the gods and the sacred laws of this kingdom," the high priest declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen. You may kiss your bride, your majesty." The kiss Kieran gave her was soft and sweet and full of promise, but it was the roar of approval that rose from the congregation, from the crowds in the streets, from the entire kingdom celebrating their union, that brought fresh tears to her eyes. They loved her. These people who had never known her name 6 months ago were cheering for her happiness. "My queen," Kieran whispered against her lips, and the title sent shivers of joy down her spine. The feast that followed was legendary. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from across the 7 kingdoms. Musicians played until dawn, and wine flowed like water. But Lyra found herself most content during the quiet moments between dances, when she and Kieran would steal away to a corner and simply hold each other, marvelling at how far they had come. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked as they swayed together to a slow ballad, her head resting on his chest. "When you walked into my cell?" "Every day," he murmured against her hair. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you. How different everything would be if I had been even a day later." "But you weren't," she said softly. "You came for me exactly when you were supposed to, when we were both ready." "Fate," he agreed, his arms tightening around her. "Though I prefer to think of it as the gods finally deciding I had suffered enough without you." The months that followed their wedding were a golden time that seemed touched by magic. Lyra took to her role as queen with a natural grace that surprised even her supporters. She established schools for servant children, created programs to help wrongly accused prisoners, and opened the palace gardens to the people on feast days. The kingdom flourished under their joint rule, and the nobles who had once grumbled about her common birth found themselves grudgingly admitting that she was exactly the queen they needed. "The baby's moving," Lyra said one evening, as they sat together in their private sitting room, Kieran's hand resting on her rounded belly. At 7 months pregnant, she felt ungainly and enormous, but Kieran looked at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Strong kicks," he said with wonder, his palm warm against her skin. "Just like their mother. Or their father," she teased. "This child is going to be stubborn and determined and absolutely impossible to manage." "Good," Kieran said fiercely. "Let them be strong. Let them know they can achieve anything they set their mind to, no matter where they start." 2 months later, their daughter was born on a spring morning when the cherry trees were in full bloom. Princess Eleanor Catherine Thornfield entered the world with a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the palace, her tiny fists waving as if she were ready to take on the entire kingdom. "She's perfect," Lyra whispered, exhausted but radiant as she held their daughter for the first time. The baby had Kieran's golden eyes and Lyra's dark hair, and the most imperious expression Lyra had ever seen on such a tiny face. "She's going to rule the world someday," Kieran said softly, his finger stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Just like her mother." 5 years later, as Lyra stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom she now called home, She marvelled at the life she had built. Princess Elena was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, already showing signs of the same fierce independence that had carried her mother through the darkest times. Their second child, Prince Alexander, slept peacefully in her arms, his father's golden eyes already beginning to show flecks of his mother's green. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, joining her on the balcony and wrapping his arms around them both. "Everything," she said softly. "How impossible this all seemed once. How I used to believe I didn't deserve to be happy. And now? Now I know that happiness isn't something you deserve," she said, leaning back against his chest. "It's something you choose every single day, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose our family and our kingdom and the life we've built together." "Forever?" he asked, the same question he had posed on their wedding night and every anniversary since. "Forever," she confirmed, the same answer she had given then and would give for all the years to come. As the sun set over their kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from believing she was nothing to knowing she was everything that mattered to the people she loved. She was no longer the frightened girl in the prison cell, waiting for someone to save her. She was Queen Lyra, wife to the king she adored, mother to the children who filled her heart to overflowing, and protector of a kingdom that had embraced her as their own. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she belonged. And that, she thought, as Kieran's arms tightened around her and their children stirred sleepily in the gathering dusk, was the most beautiful ending of all.